Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Caroline Still, and I'm a project leader in Aurora's advisory team in the Oxford office. And today I'm joined by Ruth Herbert, CEO of Carbon Capture and Storage Association, or CCSA. Ruth, welcome. It's great to have you on the show today.
It's great to be here, Caroline.
The topic of today's show, unsurprisingly, is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So I'll be referring to that as CCUS from now on. Do we need it? If so, where, why, where is it most useful, and what can we be doing more to accelerate its adoption? I'm sure you're aware, but in case you don't, a brief bit of terminology housekeeping before I launch into some burning questions. CCUS, or carbon capture, utilization, and storage, is a process by which CO2 emissions are captured from industrial processes and then used in alternative processes or stored in long-term storage in the ground. In power, CCUS can be used on baseload gas and coal plants. In industry, CCUS can be used in industrial processes that emit carbon dioxide. And for hydrogen, CCUS decarbonizes production, making what's called blue hydrogen. A brief background on our guests for listeners before we dive in. Ruth has been CEO of CCSA for the past 2 years, a company that brings together a wide range of specialist companies across the CCUS spectrum. But Ruth started her career in government in the Department of Energy and Climate Change, where she was, among other things, program manager for the electricity market reform and the integration lead for the renewable subsidization program, Contracts for Difference. She then set up LCCC, which is the independent counterparty company to the CFD, or Contracts for Difference program, where she spent 7 years. Ruth, what I love about your experience is the scope you've covered. You might be focused on carbon capture now, but you're considered, I would say, an expert in renewable subsidization and power market structure overall, which I think makes you particularly well placed to discuss carbon capture and outline why it is or isn't needed for the power system to be reliant on renewables and indeed for decarbonization of the energy system at large. So I'd like to start with the power sector, given your experience. There is a mix of views on the extent of to which CCS should be used in the power system. The government estimates that about 10 gigawatts of power CCS will be needed by 2035 to enable net zero, as it ensures energy security through the provision of low carbon firm capacity. But the counter view is that there are other technologies that maybe we should be focusing on to bridge this firm capacity gap. So long duration storage, interconnectors, nuclear, DSR, to name a few. What's CCS views on the role of carbon capture and storage in achieving net zero by 2035 in the power system in GB, especially in light of REMA's consultation 2 weeks ago and the focus on gas there?
So I think it does have a role in the power sector. It's a small role, but it's a vital one. We very much support the kind of climate change committee's view that there will need to be dispatchable gas-fired power stations with CCS or hydrogen-fired power stations. And maybe we can come on and talk about hydrogen in a moment. But I think there is clearly a need for that in the system. They won't run a lot, but I think we have been able to model and show that they can run with CCS and still have a positive impact for consumers in terms of reducing the overall cost of the system. That's both in terms of the cost of balancing as we scale up renewables, but also system reinforcement costs as well. So yeah, the view is if we want to get to a 70% or more renewable system, then we do need some of this. Exactly how much probably does depend on different scenarios and so forth. But we're looking at around maybe 10 large stations, something like that. 15 gigawatts has been floated as a sort of reasonable assumption. Could be less, could be more, depending on other choices. But the fact that we will need it, I think that's pretty clear. And obviously the government's committed to do one before 2030, but has also made really clear that they, as you say, will need to scale those up in the early 2030s.
That's an interesting angle to put in perspective there, Ruth. I'd like to sort of touch on how CCS is used in the power system when we're saying sort of 10 plants across GB. Are we thinking about those running as baseload or more as dispatchable, more flexible? And really that leads me to the question is, how flexible is CCES in power in reality?
Yes, so definitely dispatchable, so definitely flexible plant. And I'm assuming they will be developed in order to service the dispatchable power agreement, the business model that the government's come up with, which is a CFD, which actually tells the plant when it can operate, and it can operate after renewables, but before unabated gas plants. So it plays a particular role in the system, which is required to get to net zero. But also, we may still see some unabated gas plant as well that are extremely flexible and run very scarcely, for which it's probably not worth putting CCS. But we definitely see plant with CCS having a role as well. So you can see them as different assets really in the system and what service they're providing.
Servicing.
Yeah. And we haven't talked, I mean, if you want to talk about baseload, we haven't talked about bioenergy and CCS, but they're potentially you could run that as baseload, because the main value from that is actually the carbon removals, which are really important for net zero, but not just for the power sector, but for decarbonisation of other sectors as well.
That negative emissions and the sort of controversy around exactly what point is that, how negative is those negative emissions? I'm keen to touch on that later, indeed. You did just mention it in your earlier answer, sort of hydrogen, the golden child of the energy transition. So I'd like to take a step back from power and talk about the role of CCS in the hydrogen economy and how that might play out. If hydrogen is going to be the medium that we use to decarbonize difficult to decarbonize sectors, peaking in power or steel production, for example, do you feel that blue production is an inevitability if we're to scale hydrogen supply more rapidly?
Yeah, I think it's really about timescales and also kind of network capacity, I suppose. So, I have a lot of members, there's a lot of industry in the UK that really want to have low carbon hydrogen really soon, next couple of years, before 2030. Only really CCS enabled hydrogen can scale up to provide the volume and the kind of reliable source required. So I think it's inevitable that you are going to see CCS enabled hydrogen, and we've got I think we surveyed our members, and there's a pipeline of around 15 to 16 gigawatts of CCS enabled hydrogen around the UK. These are projects from kind of concept all the way through to kind of ones that are doing their feed studies and part of the government program at the moment. But I think the demand is there, and the supply can also potentially be there in the next 10 years. I think that CCS enabled hydrogen is going to play a critical role. Absolutely. I think, what it will do is it will pump prime the kind of system really for hydrogen. And then, but I think it will predominantly be used for industrial decarbonisation. So I think that's really going to be the focus. There isn't going to be a lot of spare low carbon hydrogen for anything else. I mean, there's a lot of industrial demand.
Yeah.
And as I say, we've not got any operational plants at the moment. So I think this is a big challenge just to meet that industrial demand. I think that's going to be the priority, but it will pump prime, if you like, those initial industrial cluster networks, which will pave the way for other sources of hydrogen. I think low carbon hydrogen to be able to also come into those networks.
Yeah, I think Aurora would absolutely agree with the sort of main source of hydrogen demand being industrial decarbonisation, and those sort of valuable low carbon hydrogen molecules that you produce, you're not going to be quickly using them in the power sector when there are other alternatives there in the short term. But that industrial decarbonisation, absolutely. In fact, we did some additional analysis where we looked at modelling a completely gas-free economy by 2050, so no gas at all. And all hydrogen would have to be produced by electrolysis in that system. And in that system, we'd have over 45 gigawatts of electrolyzers and over 220 gigawatts of solar and wind generation. So if we're completely taking blue hydrogen, or CCS-enabled hydrogen, as you called it, out of the mix, we're looking at a huge amount of renewables. It's possibly a little bit unfeasible at that scale. So I would agree with you that blue hydrogen seems to be part of the mix in the short term, but the priming element of the industrial clusters is very interesting as well.
I mean, I also think it's just the capacity of the electricity network and the sort of how quickly can we build enough wires to make sure that we can use all that renewable electricity. I think there will be some constraints there, and that's not to kind of put them in artificially, but there will be some engineering constraints on these systems. And I think I think the argument for kind of repurposing the gas network is quite strong in terms of kind of what's the most economic, efficient way to reach the target. But it's still going to require a huge amount of build out of the electricity network anyway, and probably, home heating and other things are going to, and electric vehicles are going to require that. So it's by no means saying we're not doing that at full pelt, but it's saying let's also use this other system that's there, that can be repurposed, that exists. And that's probably actually, I would say, a more conservationist approach is use what you've got, reuse, recycle what you've got as far as possible.
Yeah. If hydrogen is the golden child of the transition, the network build out is the problem child, I'd say. The use of CCS and hydrogen production and power can be contentious because of the other alternatives, but the harder to abate industrial sectors have far fewer options available to them besides just CCS, meaning that for sector-wide decarbonization, carbon capture and storage becomes sort of unavoidable. What are the sort of other key sectors that you see CCS needing to play a big role in for sector-wide decarbonization? Just to touch on them, because I think personally, and maybe the listeners are more familiar with power and hydrogen.
Yeah, sure. So industries like cement and glass, for example, it might also be worth just touching briefly on refineries, because a lot of people don't realize that they're in the supply chain for electric vehicles. So they're part of the electric economy as well. But I think so cement is a really easy one because it's got a very concentrated CO2 source from process emissions. So when you make cement, the process that you go through releases CO2 from the rocks. So it's not fuel switching alone. They won't solve the problem. There are process emissions. And so really CCS on cement is seen as essential for its decarbonisation. And cement, and by decarbonising cement, you can largely decarbonise buildings, because it's responsible for around 80% of the CO2 in buildings, and therefore, and yet it's not very much of the cost in buildings, and therefore for a very small, probably almost negligible increase in cost in a building, you can decarbonise it. So again, looking at kind of commercial deployment of this, you can see it's a no-brainer to be doing that and opening up those new low carbon product markets where hopefully there'll be a premium for those products. Glass is another one where they can get quite far actually with just switching to hydrogen. And there are glassworks, Pilkington, and others around the country, but Pilkington I mentioned because they're close to the HyNet cluster, and they want to take the hydrogen from that CCS-enabled hydrogen plant this decade. They can get quite far with just hydrogen, but they also have emissions from their processes, so they will need CCS also at some point down the line. Refineries again can do an awful lot of things and produce an awful lot of different products. One of the products produced in the Humber refinery is a special kind of graphite coke that is used in electric vehicle batteries. I think it's the only producer in Europe, so really strategically important site for the electric car industry. But again, if that's to be low carbon, then they need CCS on that site. So I think that the interesting thing about decarbonising the industrial supply chain is it decarbonises then lots of other sectors of the economy. So that's really why when you sort of read into the Climate Change Committee's reports on how to meet the UK's legally binding carbon budgets, you see that CCS appears in quite a few appendices because it's actually relevant to quite a lot of sectors. Again, transport, fuels, decarbonised fuels. Again, to get to the higher grade sustainable aviation fuels, for example, if you put CCS on the production of those, then you can get to a much higher percentage of decarbonisation. However, we're still obviously also looking at things like direct air capture and BECCS that we talked about before, because those can provide carbon removals. So the aviation industry is investing in both carbon removals and also sustainable aviation fuels with CCS. So CCS is in both. Which route is going to prove to be the most cost-effective and best for the climate, I think is still being determined.
Yeah, that's all very interesting, actually. There's quite a few of those areas that I didn't actually know that much about, particularly the glass and the sort of dual angle of the aviation industry. We've spoken quite a bit about how CCS is beneficial, even, some could argue essential in the industrial sector and beneficial in the other sectors so far. But I'd like to sort of start unpacking the barriers as well and the challenges that the industry is facing. So I know that the CCS projects in the government's Track 1 acceleration program, you've mentioned it already, the HyNet cluster, technically supposed to be operational by 2025, removing about 4.5 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. But at the moment, CCS has not been deployed to the scale, and partly because the facilities are capital intensive to deploy and expensive to operate. What, in your opinion, is the main challenge that's preventing this 2025 deadline from being met, given that it is literally around the corner? And can we remove this blocker or other blockers in time to reach the 2030 target of removing 10 million tons of carbon dioxide per year?
Yeah, so obviously it's all about the 2030 target. Really, this commitment to deploy the first 2 clusters mid-decade was made in 2020, but then there were a number of kind of political and other delays really that meant that we're really now still waiting for the final investment decisions on those first 2 clusters. We're expecting those by the end of summer, and if they happen on time, or we'd prefer them to happen before summer, ideally, then some of those projects can be operational and storing CO2 by the end of 2027. So mid-decade becomes end of 2027. And those 2 Track 1 clusters, that's HyNet in the northwest of England and the East Coast cluster in the northeast of England, between them will probably capture and store potentially a bit less than a third of that 2030 target. So where's the rest coming from? You might say, well, the government has already issued an expressions of interest process for Track 1 expansion of HyNet. So there's another 2.2 million tons available there that companies have bid in to connect to, and there will be a similar process launched for the East Coast cluster this year, according to the latest statements from the government. So expanding the first 2 clusters is clearly on the cards. In addition, the government have announced that the Scottish cluster and so Acorn is the store offshore, and the Viking store offshore in the South Humber will be the next 2 stores to go ahead, and that they will be able to select their anchor projects to move forward as well. But we don't have a timetable for that. So am I confident that they will take their final investment decisions in a much shorter space of time than the first 2? So rather than taking 3 years, that we might do that within 12 months from now? Potentially, it's possible. It's obviously a lot easier once you've done the first ones. But clearly there needs to be more budget set aside for that. If they are going to be signed up within 12 months, then yes, they can probably commission before 2030 and we might hit our 2030 target. But this is all obviously very tight given it's an election year. So momentum and continuity is really, really important here. The legislation that went through last year in the Energy Act, the detailed business model design, the CO2 network code, all of the detailed work that's been done lays a really strong foundation. But unless contracts are signed very soon, I think investor confidence will drop the closer we get to the election. And unless there's continuity in terms of a recognition cross-party that there needs to be sort of visible funding envelope for CCUS so that the follow-on projects have the confidence to keep investing in developing projects, I think, we're just going to lose momentum, just as the rest of the world, I think, is starting to pick up momentum.
Okay. So cross-party continuity, momentum are sort of the key things that you see needing to happen over the next year in order to get those decisions to financial close. Is there a concern around sort of skills and labor shortages in the industry in GB? And what about sort of the storage and transport networks of CO2 and sort of removing that carbon dioxide but having nowhere really to send it? What work is being done around that, and how can that sort of alleviate investor uncertainty?
I think there's genuinely been a bit of concern about needing fiscal stability in the offshore area to make sure that we can kind of retain the offshore supply chain and repurpose them for development of offshore CO2 transport and storage networks. I think that is a very genuine concern. At the moment, we have a number of areas of the CCUS value chain where the UK has real strengths. We did a report and a kind of heat map of this as part of our supply chain strategy that was published last year. And there's certainly, I think, a lot of homegrown capabilities that can not just service CCUS clusters in the UK, but potentially global market, which is potentially, around $1 trillion or so. It's going to be quite a big market over time. So I think the challenge, as I said before, is maintaining those supply chains as those industries are also going through the transition. So if you're in manufacturing in the UK at the moment, you've got high energy costs, you've got high employment costs, you're facing CO2 prices for the first time, potentially, as free allowances are removed later in the decade. Are you going to be able to maintain your global competitiveness in that environment? Do you need CCUS yourself to actually decarbonize and be able to supply the EU as well, given the carbon border adjustment mechanism there, and potentially also the UK going forward? But you may also be manufacturing things that are needed for the deployment of CCUS. So you've got this situation where we would really like to have gigafactories for modular carbon capture equipment in the UK, but the wider supply chain that is needed for those, like steel and other things, which are going to be needed in great quantities to do this transition, are either potentially leaving the UK or downsizing what they're doing in the UK. That could be an issue. So I think there needs to be a coordinated industrial strategy to make sure that when we build the strategic decarbonisation infrastructure in the UK, that is available to our strategic supply chain assets, and that we make sure they have access to it and they can decarbonise using it, and therefore that we can keep them in the UK and supplying this infrastructure both here and abroad. So yeah, it's a complicated web, but I think it's, the supply chain is here at the moment. It's moving quickly enough in the UK so that it stays here, because a lot has been attracted to what's happening in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act and the kind of, I guess, explosion of small projects in the US that can get away under the tax incentive in under 45Q. We're really pleased with the government's announcement of GIGA, the Green Industries Growth Accelerator. In particular, I think the £960 million of that, which is going to be available for CCUS and hydrogen, for manufacturing components for really kickstarting the supply chain in the UK. But the key thing that the supply chain say they also need to be able to invest in upscaling their capability and their capacity is to have that long-term visibility of the deployment in the UK. So really need to see the funding envelope over future years, the volumes that the government intends to deploy, whether that's in power, industry, hydrogen production, so that the supply chain can kind of invest and scale up accordingly.
Yeah, that's a interesting look at the budget that they've provided. That sort of touches on scalability, which is one of the last barriers I wanted to talk about a little bit, because my understanding is that it's more of a myth, really, of a barrier, not a barrier in itself. But one of the things that's sometimes spoken about in CCS is that, you know, it's not yet scalable in the power sector, and it isn't quite yet a proven technology. And I know that this is not entirely true. I want to ask you to explore that a little bit for me.
So yeah, I think the companies that are looking at this and are doing their feed studies, I think would argue that it's, you know, absolutely possible to build this at scale. Clearly, we'll be doing something fairly novel, but other people around the world are also looking at that in parallel, and so there are going to be lessons learned. I'm sure there's going to be an evolution in terms of optimizing these plants, but absolutely it is something that people are designing and getting ready to construct. And you'll have seen, I think, that people have already appointed teams, EPCs to do this. So yeah, I think they are clearly feeling ready to go at scale. On the storage side, probably the most famous project that's been operational for most 30 years now is the Sleipner CO2 storage project in Norway, which has been storing in a deep saline aquifer offshore. So very similar to the store that the East Coast Cluster will use. So the good thing about that project is there's a huge amount of data about how the CO2 has performed over time. And that's all in the public domain. So that's really, we're standing on the shoulders of the Norwegians and the good work that they've done on this. In terms of storage in depleted oil and gas fields, there it's even clearer, really, because there's a lot of experience of that, albeit in the enhanced oil recovery or enhanced gas recovery operations, where they've been able to observe over many, many decades how the CO2 that remains in those formations behaves over time. So these have been really research projects alongside oil and gas operational projects. So they've not necessarily been done with the sole purpose of storing as much CO2 as possible, but they have provided a lot of information. The good thing about depleted oil and gas fields is they're really well understood. So you really have a well-characterized site, you know exactly how it's going to behave. And so it's much quicker to get it up and running and injecting at scale. However, they're often, for example, there's a process of repurposing some of the infrastructure, which does take some time to do correctly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that site in Norway that's been operational for 30 years. That's a significant data set that the industry could use, or does use, no doubt. I'm conscious that we've spent quite a lot of time discussing the UK, and with your sort of introduction of Norway, it makes me think that I'd like to sort of expand this more to a European, if not global scale. And I'm dying to ask, what are the other hotspots of CCUS development globally at the moment? Because you mentioned that that's sort of kicking off globally. What are those regions doing better than the UK? Is it market design, access to financing, or is it just geographical luck?
So I guess the closest to us and Norway is probably the Netherlands. If we stay in Europe to begin with, the Netherlands has, I guess, an approach fairly similar to the UK in that they have carbon-based contracts for difference, so CCFDs, which they have administered to a number of projects within the cluster in the Rotterdam region, so the Porthos cluster, and the final investment decisions were taken on all of those projects in October last year. So that is really the first cluster FID, if you like, and that's in construction now. I guess they too had a protracted period of negotiation and of the environmental permitting of the sites, but still managed to obviously get their FID done last year. So I guess they're a little bit ahead of the UK, although it's a smaller cluster than the ones that we're trying to do in the UK. But a really good example of just getting on and getting started, I think. Then France has said that they want to do 3 industrial clusters in Le Havre, Thau and Dunkirk. So that's really positive, but we don't have a lot of detail about how exactly or when at the moment. But they are developing their strategy very rapidly. Germany has also recently announced their industrial carbon management strategy and their ambitions on CCUS. So you can see now, following the EU's industrial carbon management strategy in February, a lot of the member states are now have been working in parallel and are now publishing their own strategies. And what remains to be seen really is whether the national governments will put in place contracts for difference and funding for those at scale to really get large scale projects and clusters going. Because the innovation funding that the EU provides really is driving investment in the project development pipeline, but those projects will never get to commercial operations without some kind of operational support. Obviously, the ETS will drive a lot of action, but the prices at the moment just aren't driving operations. If you look to the US, what they've done about that is they've put in place a CO2 tax credit. So they've said $80 per ton for a normal project. I think it's almost double that if it's carbon removals. And that's really enabling a lot of projects to go ahead, just on the basis that if they can get them going, they can, for that price, then they can just get on and do them. They don't have to wait for a government competition. There's a huge advantage with that, just unleashing that commercial capability. It drives innovation, it drives cost reduction and so forth. However, if you want to get coordinated hubs, clusters, infrastructure like Europe is looking at, then I think we still find in the US that they're going to need some state funding, some federal funding potentially as well, and the coordination of all those different funding providers along with the tax credit, and whether that's all stackable or whether it's, how it's accounted for. I think that's still a complication. So along with obviously planning and permitting in different regions, which, some are more accustomed to this than others. So I think you're seeing the most activity in Texas because they're used to permitting this kind of activity.
Yeah.
And there's a concentration of supply chain and skills there. It remains to be seen how quickly other regions will deliver clusters in the US. And then there's a similar tax credit in Canada, and they're starting to look at cluster approaches there too. Then I think you need to look at Middle East. Middle East is really interesting because there's potentially a lot of cheap onshore storage, a lot of land, potentially, carbon dioxide removal, CDR, so direct air capture with storage, or even bioenergy carbon capture could be really scaled up there quite easily. So I think that's really exciting. Aviation fuels and things with CCS, also a big focus for them. Asia more broadly, I think you're looking at kind of there's a lot of countries looking at this, looking at regional hubs between Malaysia, Indonesia, and that region. Some really exciting bits of legislation and incentives developing. So I think we're seeing a lot happening. I'm sure I've missed somewhere, but I think in general, Japan also looking at this, obviously, and Australia have been involved in CCUS for a long time and are now also sort of driving forward with larger projects in the pipeline. So yeah, a lot happening. And I think for me, countries like Brazil have also said they want to do CCS, and you're even seeing North African and some other African countries talk about this because of the impact of the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU. If they want to industrialize as they kind of become more developed as countries, they are going to need CCS if they are still to be able to market their products to the EU.
Yeah, that was a really interesting summary. Thanks. To me, it sounds like everyone's, let's say in the global West, in a similar sort of place of the policy and the targets being announced and the policy being developed to accommodate and try and meet those targets at the moment, with no real clear players that are significantly ahead or significantly behind. But, it's interesting to hear how it's being viewed in terms of carbon border tax and how that might play a role in the industrial side of it as well.
Yeah, and I think it's been interesting as well to see how Norway has, had the lead for a long time and has developed the Northern Lights facility, for example, to take CO2 from the rest of Europe, and a shipping capability with ships that are on order and be operational very soon. And then you look at, say, a country like Denmark, which hasn't really been pro CCS for a long time, is now has sort of actually ended up being one of the first countries to prove that you can take CO2 cross-border and store it. They took CO2 from Belgium last year and stored it in the Greensands project. It was a short-term trial, but it was a proof of concept. And I think they really kind of, everybody's eyes opened and everybody woke up and said, look, you can do this quickly where there's political will. And actually, countries can catch up very quickly. And I think it kind of, galvanized others with CO2 storage capability in Europe to think, well, what are we doing about being in this market? So I think it is a really interesting time, especially with the German government very keen to retain their industries, their manufacturing capabilities,
of course.
And how that links with CBAM and low carbon product standards, I think going forward is going to be really interesting.
Something you mentioned earlier with regards to sort of Texas having that skill set and sort of being well positioned to take a step into the CCS industry, sort of made me think of some of the more divisive conversations that we often have surrounding CCS as a technology. And I don't know if we'd be doing this podcast or the listeners justice if we didn't sort of touch on some of these divisive issues. So there's an ongoing concern that the use of CCS in power and beyond will facilitate the further expansion of oil and gas production and extraction, sort of being used as a scapegoat, shall we say, for the oil and gas industry. What's CCSA's opinion of this, and how do you normally handle this question?
We're very clear in the CCSA that we need to deal with the emissions we have today. And there is a huge amount of demand for CCS from the industrial sector to tackle their emissions, and they need that urgently. A lot of the people that we've surveyed, and we surveyed about 90 million tonnes worth of demand in the UK.
Wow.
And about 75% of that really wanted to be decarbonised by 2030, either because their investors are demanding it, their customers are demanding it, or they simply don't think they can compete beyond, the late 20s with an inferior product, with a product that is just the basic carbon intensive product. They need to differentiate themselves with a low carbon product in order to be able to kind of survive in a globally competitive industry when faced with higher CO2 prices for emissions and so forth. So the demand is coming from industry predominantly. A lot of that is process emissions, as we said before. That can't be dealt with any other way.
Yeah.
So regardless of what you do, what fuel you use, regardless of fuel switching to whatever type of hydrogen, or in some cases, maybe electrification can get there. But as we know, a lot of processes need very high temperatures. And we're not quite there yet. Doesn't mean something won't come forward, but I think the reality is 2030 is very close. We can only achieve our net zero targets for 2030 with technologies that are ready to go now at scale commercially. We can't afford to wait for whatever else might come along. So we do need to build these CO2 networks, this decarbonisation infrastructure for the uses we absolutely know that we need it for. The fact that a lot of the skills and capabilities for that offshore are in the oil and gas sector, well, great, because they're going to have less business anyway going forward because they're producing fossil fuels. And over time, we know that's going to reduce. So let's repurpose those people. Let's get them helping to solve emissions. Let's get them into industries like CCUS. I think that's a positive story. It's definitely a positive story for the communities that I visit that are coastal. Typically, we've got large industrial clusters close to ports, deep ports, where we've been trading as a nation in these manufactured materials or fuels for many decades. And it's close by to offshore infrastructure, pipelines that we can reuse, sending the CO2 back the way it came, back underground, back to nature's store for this CO2. I think this is a positive repurposing of assets and people, and that's the story we should be telling. Otherwise, you're telling these communities, let's close down manufacturing, let's close down offshore activity. And, yes, a lot of them are going into offshore wind. That's great. We need more and more to do that. But there is also plenty of growth opportunity in decarbonising our industries. And for the capture part, our chemicals and process engineering capabilities are world leading. And again, the alternative, I think, is to actually to offshore all of these industries and to just import products from elsewhere. And whether they're low carbon or not, I think if they end up being low carbon, we're paying other people somewhere else to do the CCUS there, and then just paying the premium for the low carbon product to import it here and the transportation of that. So I think it makes sense to do it ourselves. We've got a head start. We've got the capability. We've got world leading legislation, regulations on this. So, I think we should be doing that globally. Of course, I think we need to see that goes hand in hand with scaling up renewables as fast as we can go, with having those difficult conversations about how we prioritize infrastructure and how we kind of conserve energy as far as we can, whether that's in manufacturing, whether that's in the home. All of the conversations we're going to have about making the best use of our resources to get to net zero as efficiently, as cheaply as possible. But yeah, it's so part of the solution, but it is not the solution. It is a small part of a much bigger picture, which involves all the other technologies going as fast as they can as well.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I'm definitely going to be using that. I think the sort of key things that you highlighted for me is the real demand for CCS as a technology comes from industrial emissions. So the steel, the cement, the glass, etc., that we spoke about earlier. It's also needed in, hydrogen production and power as well. But, industry has no other alternative. So that's going to be going ahead anyway. And sort of not leveraging the skill sets that we have would be in the oil and gas industry, that is, would be cutting off your nose to spite your face. I mean, that's just an antagonistic unnecessarily. So yeah, very, very well phrased there. We've covered a lot of ground, and honestly, I could keep chatting about this topic for ages because there's so many dimensions to it, but unfortunately, we're going to have to draw to a close. I think CCS is one of those fascinating technologies that transcends the power sector, meaning so many dimensions have to be considered when you talk about it, which, does make for great conversation. So just to end on a more personal note, Ruth, how have you found the jump from power and renewables focus to a more heavy industry or heavy duty industry? And what's been the change working at CCS that you've enjoyed the most?
I think what's been really, really interesting is seeing what we did on electricity market reform, where we set, a levy control framework, a budget for renewable CFDs in the future for kind of a 4 to 5 year period. That really gave that certainty of deployment to the supply chain, which enabled developers to really develop lots and lots of projects to compete for those CFDs and to really drive down technology costs as well. I think that's so translatable to where we are on CCUS now. We've got the first bilaterally negotiated projects, those 8 projects in the first 2 clusters going through. But we need very quickly to move to a more mechanistic, less political way of just getting CFDs allocated to projects as efficiently as possible and provide that longer term funding envelope that drives that innovation in the supply chain and that confidence in supply chain. So I think there are so many parallels that I think it's almost like we're at the same point that I felt like we're at 10 years ago with offshore wind. And there is, also in terms of the network issues, thinking now about how can we regulate these networks. The key difference in the UK is the regulated asset-based model for the CO2 networks, which doesn't exist in the US or in the Netherlands, but is really, really interesting because these networks are going from nothing to quite a lot in a really short space of time. So how does Ofgem's treatment of anticipatory investment, how do we get that rapid rollout of these networks beyond the initial economic licenses being issued? That's such an important issue. And we've seen what happens when that goes wrong, when we saw lots and lots of point-to-point connections in offshore wind, not a coordinated network approach. And then also people being constrained and not able to connect because the grid wasn't ready. So there are lots of parallels between, I guess, what was a rapid expansion of electricity grid and what's going to be actually, I think, repurposing, but also some expansion of new CO2 grid in the UK. So I just feel like I'm coming up against the same challenges, but just a different technology. So it hasn't been as difficult as I thought to kind of go from electricity to gas. I think because this is about a new decarbonisation technology, a network that needs to expand really quickly, and I guess an industry that needs to be primed by the government that needs to give that deployment certainty. So the parallels are really similar. The feeling is similar as well. The colleagues, the excitement, the passion, people really wanting to make this happen and taking a lot of long personal strides to try to make it happen on all sides, government, industry, stakeholders. So a really exciting place to work at the moment.
I can imagine, yeah. I mean, having been quite important in driving the sort of early stages of renewables and now doing the same for CCS, I'm excited to see what the next technology is that you jump into 10, 20 years down the line. It's been so great chatting to you, Ruth. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat to us at Aurora, and best of luck going forward. Hopefully the various uncertainty in the policy is cleared over the next couple of years, and I'm excited to see what happens next with CCSA.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you.
That was Ruth Herbert, CEO of Carbon Capture and Storage Association, talking to Caroline Still, a project leader in Aurora's advisory team. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.